Some love stories arrive with noise, a thunderclap of first sight, a breathless chase across train platforms. A love letter slipped under the wrong door that somehow found the right person. Some love stories announce themselves like weather, loud and unmistakable, with no room for doubt about what is happening. This one announced itself as a property dispute. Specifically, it began with a fence. Not a metaphorical fence, the kind that poets write about when they mean emotional distance or guarded hearts. An actual physical fence, 8 feet of split-rail timber running along the eastern boundary of the Harlan property in Draper's Hollow, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1879. A fence that had, according to the surveyor's original markings, been installed somewhere between 2 and 4 feet past where it was supposed to be, a discrepancy that had gone unnoticed and uncontested for roughly 15 years, until Clara Dean noticed it, and until Eli Harlan told her, with the patient confidence of a man who has never once considered the possibility that a woman holding a surveyor's map might know something he doesn't, that she was mistaken. She was not mistaken. Clara Dean was 26 years old, the daughter of George and Martha Dean, who had worked a modest 40-acre parcel beside the Harlan property for most of Clara's life. Her father had died the previous winter, her mother the spring before that, and Clara was now the sole owner of a farm that needed more attention than any one person should reasonably be expected to give it, which meant she had become, out of sheer necessity, the kind of woman who noticed things. Fence lines, water flow, which fields were draining wrong, which merchants were adjusting their scales in ways that were technically invisible but mathematically obvious. She was also, as the community of Draper's Hollow had come to understand, through a series of incidents that were discussed at the general store with considerable appreciation, a woman who did not let inaccurate information pass without comment. Ellie Harlan was 33, the owner and sole operator of the Harlan Cattle Ranch, a spread that had grown in the years since his father's death from something modest to something that required genuine management. He had dark eyes, broad hands, and the unhurried manner of a man who had made enough decisions under pressure to stop being afraid of them. He was known in Draper's Hollow for being fair and for being steady, and for occasionally being so certain of his own conclusions that he walked all the way to the end of a wrong road before he'd consent to check the map. He and Clara had been neighbors for her entire life. They had coexisted with the comfortable, low-maintenance diplomacy of people who share a boundary and respect the implicit agreement that boundaries exist. She had brought food when his father passed. He had helped reinforce her barn roof during a storm 2 summers ago without being asked and without staying long enough to make it an event. They were, in the taxonomy of rural community, good neighbors, which is its own kind of relationship, warm enough to matter, distant enough to ask nothing of either party, until Clara walked up to his fence with a surveyor's map and a measuring rope on a Tuesday morning in October. "Your eastern boundary is off," she said without preamble, because she'd decided on the walkover that there was no version of this that benefited from softening. Ellie looked at her, then at the map, then back at her. "It's not off," he said. "It's approximately 3.5 feet into my property," she said. "My father had that fence surveyed." "Surveyed by whom?" A pause. A short pause. He didn't say. Clara waited. "The point," Eli said, recovering, "is that this fence has been here for 15 years without complaint." "The point," Clara said. And here something happened in her voice, not sharpness, something more like bright precision, the tone of a woman who finds a good argument genuinely enjoyable, is that 15 years of a thing being wrong doesn't make it right. It just makes it a longer-standing error. Eli looked at her for a moment. She had brown eyes, he noticed. She was waiting for him to say something conclusive. He couldn't think of anything conclusive. "I'll have it resurveyed," he said, which was not conceding, he told himself. That was just due diligence. "I'll be interested to see those results," Clara said, pleasantly, as though they were discussing the weather. She rolled up her map, tucked it under her arm, and walked back toward her property with the relaxed stride of a person who already knows how something ends. Eli watched her go and thought, with genuine bewilderment, that he had never in his life lost an argument that fast. The resurvey confirmed it. The fence was wrong. He moved the fence himself 3.5 feet east over the course of a Saturday alone, in the quiet dignity of a man correcting a 15-year error. Clara didn't come over to watch. She didn't need to. but he saw her lamp on in the farmhouse window that evening. And there was something about that soft light, just the ordinary fact of her being on the other side of the field, that made the day feel less like a defeat than he'd expected. That was October. By December, they had found approximately 7 additional things to disagree about. The creek watershed that ran along the northeastern corner of both properties was the next. Then the question of whose cattle had gotten into whose winter oats. Then a dispute about a shared well that had been, as far as Eli could determine, operating just fine until Clara Dean began asking whether the casing had ever been properly lined, after which it was somehow impossible to use the well without noticing that the casing had, in fact, never been properly lined. These were not fights. That was the thing everyone in Draper's Hollow understood without having it explained, even as they discussed it at the general store with the attentiveness of people watching a very good play. Clara and Eli never raised their voices. They never got mean. There was always in every disagreement a kind of fundamental respect, the quality of two people who are taking each other seriously rather than just waiting for the other person to be quiet. What there also was, though nobody said it directly, was energy. A particular charge to those conversations at the fence line or the creek bank or the county surveyor's office, as though both people arrived already interested, already alert, already slightly more alive than they'd been 5 minutes before. Ruth Coleman, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Clarence, said it plainly one afternoon. The Dean girl and the Harlan boy could light a lantern just by arguing in the same room. Nobody disagreed. Several people nodded. Clara was aware of none of this, or rather, she was aware of the observations and had filed them in the category of things that were other people's business and therefore not worth acknowledging. She was not a woman given to romantic speculation, at least not about herself. She was practical in the way that loss teaches practicality, and she had learned in the 2 years since her father's death that sentiment was expensive and attention to detail was not. She kept good accounts. She made good decisions. She did not spend time on what-ifs, but she was also honest. She'd been raised on it, and honesty, applied inward, has a way of producing conclusions you weren't entirely prepared for. Eli Harlan, she had concluded, some weeks after the fence incident and somewhere in the middle of a long argument about whether the creek needed to be dredged or rerouted, was the most genuinely interesting person she'd spoken to in years. Not because he was always right, he wasn't. Not because he was always reasonable, he wasn't that either, but because he listened, actually listened with his full attention in the way that certain people do where you can feel the thinking happening in real time. He never interrupted her to wait for his turn to speak. He interrupted her, when he did, because something she said had produced a thought that couldn't wait. There was a difference, and Clara, who had spent considerable time in conversations where nobody actually listened to anyone, noticed it immediately. She also noticed, though she kept this firmly in the section of observations she had no intention of acting on, that when he laughed, which happened more than either of them would have predicted during arguments about watershed drainage, it changed his whole face. She was not going to say any of this. She had her principles, and her principles included not being the first one to name a thing before she was certain the other person had seen it too. Eli, for his part, was experiencing something he did not have immediate language for. He was a man who moved slowly through decisions, who distrusted impulse and valued the kind of certainty that only came from looking at a problem from every angle until one angle turned out to be obviously correct. This process worked well for cattle management and land decisions and negotiations with suppliers. It had never been applied with any success to a woman who showed up at his fence line with a surveyor's map and changed the architecture of his Tuesdays permanently. He found himself, without having made any specific decision, engineering reasons to be near the shared property line. The water situation really did need regular attention. The cattle really did need to be kept away from the eastern section. These were legitimate concerns. The fact that Clara was usually working her south field in the mornings, which was visible from the eastern fence line, was entirely incidental. His hired hand Danny, who was 17 and believed himself to be extremely perceptive, mentioned once that Eli had checked the eastern fence line 11 times in 3 weeks. Eli told him to mind the cattle. Danny minded the cattle. But he also later told his mother, and his mother told Ruth Coleman, and from there it was simply a matter of time. Winter came to Draper's Hollow that year with the businesslike efficiency of a Wyoming winter, which means it arrived without much ceremony and settled in as though it planned to stay permanently. The community gathered for what warmth and company it could manufacture, which in 1879 meant the Founders' Night celebration at the community hall in late January, a yearly event that involved fiddle music, a great quantity of food, and the particular collective mood of people who have made it through the darkest part of the season together and are feeling grateful about it. Clara came with her neighbor Anna. Eli came because Danny had told him he'd been spending too much time alone checking fence lines, which Eli chose to interpret as concern for his social well-being rather than the editorial it plainly was. They found each other across the room the way people who have been pretending not to track each other's location sometimes do, with a suddenness that surprised only the people it happened to. "Harlan," she said. "Dean," he said. Then, because the habit of their acquaintance demanded it, the Eastfield drain held through the freeze. "I know," she said. "I checked it Thursday. I checked it Friday. You're a day behind. I had cattle issues Thursday." "You always have cattle issues Thursday," she said, with the tone of a person who has paid attention to someone else's schedule longer than she intended. He looked at her. She was wearing a green dress the color of pine needles and had her dark hair pinned up in the practical way she always wore it. She was watching him with those brown eyes that had, over the past few months, become the standard against which he now measured alertness in any other conversation.
"Is that so?" he said.
"I'm observant," she said. They stood together at the edge of the dancing and talked for what turned out to be 40 minutes without either of them noticing time passing. Anna, across the room, caught Clara's eye at some point and gave her a look of such sustained meaningfulness that Clara had to glance away before she started laughing. Then a young man appeared. His name was Thomas Alcott, newly arrived in Draper's Hollow from somewhere east, good-looking in an easy, uncomplicated way that suggested no one had ever disagreed with him at length. He made his way to Clara with the confidence of a man who had not yet encountered the specific social geography of the situation he was entering. He asked her to dance. Clara glanced at Eli. Just a glance, the kind that lasts less than a second but carries approximately 3 months of unspoken conversation inside it. Eli, who had in that half-second registered something in his chest that he would have been hard-pressed to name accurately and easy-pressed to name honestly, managed to smile. "Go ahead," he said, with the light, generous tone of a man being tested and doing reasonably well at it. "At this rate, Clara, you'll be a spinster by 30. Take the opportunities that present themselves." He meant it warmly. He meant it the way he meant everything in their running conversation, with the ironic affection that had become their particular register, the shorthand of two people who had been talking to each other long enough to develop their own dialect. He meant it as a joke between friends, which is sometimes exactly what a joke between friends is, and sometimes, as Clara Dean understood very clearly in that moment, something considerably more than a joke wrapped in the safety of one. She looked at him, and in her expression, just for a moment, before the composure settled back into place like water finding its level, was something he hadn't seen there before. Or maybe something he'd been looking at for months without allowing himself to read. She took one small step toward him. Just one step. The kind of step that doesn't change the geography of a room but changes the weight of a conversation entirely. And she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, with the smile of someone who has decided the moment has arrived, "Not unless you ask me." Then she turned to Thomas Alcott, perfectly pleasant, and said, "Thank you, but I think I'll sit this dance out." She walked toward the refreshment table as though nothing of consequence had occurred. Thomas looked at Eli. "Go find someone to dance with," Eli said without looking at him. He was watching Clara at the refreshment table. She had picked up a cup of something and was talking to Anna, and she was not looking at him, and that was somehow its own kind of statement. The deliberate composure of a person who has said the exact thing they meant to say and has decided the rest is his problem. He stood there for a while. He walked home under a sky so thick with stars that Wyoming in January looked like someone had taken the whole of the Milky Way and hung it 2 feet above the ground for the specific benefit of a man who needed something enormous to think in front of. "Not unless you ask me." He turned it over. He was a careful thinker. He had never made a major decision by accident, and he wasn't going to start now. But here was the thing he could not argue his way out of. And he had tried. She had been saying it for months. Not in those words. In other words, in 100 other forms. In the way she stayed at the fence line past the time the conversation required. In the way she argued with him, never around him, always directly into whatever he'd just said, as though his actual opinion mattered enough to actually refute. In the way she'd noticed he always had cattle issues on Thursdays. In the way she had looked at him tonight in the half-second before she looked away. He had been receiving a message. He had filed it under things to think about later. He had left it there so long that she had tonight, with great patience and zero drama, simply handed it to him directly. He stopped walking. The road was empty. The snow was blue in the starlight, and the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and everything was very quiet. He thought about what he'd said. At this rate, you'll be a spinster by 30. He'd called it a joke. It was a joke. It was also the voice of a man using humor to hold something at arm's length that he was afraid to look at directly, because looking at it directly meant deciding, and deciding meant committing, and committing meant that the question of Clara Dean and what she meant to his daily life and his weekly expectations and the ambient quality of his mornings had an answer, and the answer was large. He stood in the road for a long time. Then he walked home, sat at the kitchen table, and spent the next hour applying the same patient, methodical attention he gave to land assessments and cattle decisions, to the question of what exactly he'd been doing for the past 3 months and what, specifically, he intended to do about it. The conclusions were uncomfortable. He had been indirect, which was unlike him. He had been afraid, which was also unlike him, or at least unlike the version of himself he preferred. And he had made a woman who deserved a great deal better than vague gestures and fence-line conversations. Wonder whether he intended to say anything at all. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. By morning, he had a plan. Not a romantic plan in the arranged, performative sense. Just a plan. The way he made all plans, practical and honest and aimed at the actual point. He went to her farm on a Sunday, which was not unusual. He went with a post-hole digger because the corner post on her northwest fence had been listing since the hard frost in November, and it was going to fail before spring, and he had been meaning to address it for weeks, and there was no reason to complicate a simple gesture by making it into something other than what it was. She was in the yard, splitting kindling when he came through the gate. She looked at the post-hole digger. She looked at him. Northwest corner, he said. I know, she said. I've been watching it list for 2 months. It'll fail before the thaw. I know that too. I figured I'd see to it, he said. She looked at him for a moment. The way she looked at things, she was deciding how to categorize. I'll make coffee, she said. He fixed the fence post. It took about 45 minutes. She brought coffee when he'd finished, and they sat on the rail fence in the January cold, which was the kind of cold that makes warmth feel significant, holding their cups and watching a pair of her horses move around the paddock in the gray morning light. The silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. They'd arrived at that kind of silence somewhere around the 6th or 7th argument without deciding to. It was the silence of two people who are comfortable with each other's thinking. He set down his cup. I've been considering what you said at the social, he said. Have you? She said. Not a question. The careful neutral of a woman giving no quarter. I want to be direct, he said. You've been fairly indirect for several months, she said. But I'm listening. He looked at the horses. I have a tendency, he said slowly, to take longer than I should to say the things that matter. I know that about myself. I'm not going to offer it as an excuse because it isn't one. All right, she said. I've been coming to your fence line 11 times in 3 weeks for reasons that had approximately nothing to do with the water situation. I know, she said. I thought you might. I counted the visits, she said. I was curious whether you'd eventually notice you were counting them. He looked at her. She was watching the horses, her profile composed and still and faintly amused. What I want to say, he said, is that I'd like to come calling on you properly, if you're willing. Supper this week to start, and we'll see from there. Yes, she said simply. Then she turned to look at him, and the amusement was there, but something else was underneath it, something warmer and more patient. That, she said, was the most logistically phrased expression of romantic interest I have ever heard. Was it wrong? He said. No, she said. It was exactly right. That's why I've been waiting for it. What followed was, by the collective memory of Draper's Hollow, a courtship that was fully in character, which is to say honest and argumentative and surprisingly funny and devoid of any of the careful performances that courtship sometimes produces in people who are trying to be something other than what they are. There was a disagreement about the best variety of winter wheat for the region that lasted 6 days and was settled only by the crop records at the county assessor's office, which vindicated Clara so completely that Eli was quiet for a moment before saying she was right, and she had been right, and he didn't know why he'd pushed back as hard as he did. And she had said, still looking at the records, "Because you're stubborn, Harlan," and he had said, "You knew that already." And she had said, "I did. Yes. That's why I waited for the assessor's records." There was a Sunday afternoon in March when they rode out to the ridge above town and sat on a rock in the cold sunshine and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with property lines or cattle or watershed drainage, about their families, their histories, their losses, their habits of mind, the shape of what they imagined a life could be. Eli was not, by nature, a man who talked easily about these things. He discovered sitting on that rock with Clara that he was, in her specific company, more willing to speak than he'd realized he could be. "What do you like about ranching?" she asked him once on one of those Sunday rides, in the direct way she asked everything as though she actually wanted to know. "The decisions are honest," he said, after thinking. "You make them, and the cattle and the land tell you whether you were right. There's no ambiguity." She nodded slowly. "What do you find difficult about it?" Nobody had ever asked him that in quite that way. "Being wrong alone," he said. "When a decision fails and there's nobody to help you think through what happened. Not for the sympathy, for the thinking." She was quiet for a moment. "I know that feeling," she said. "What about you?" he said. "What do you find difficult, people who don't listen?" she said. "I've spent considerable energy in my life having thoughts that nobody received. It becomes a habit of low expectations." He looked at her. "I'm going to receive them," he said. It was perhaps the most important thing he said to her across all the years that followed, and he said it in early spring on a cold rock above Draper's Hollow before he'd even asked her properly, with no arrangement and no ceremony, just the plain declaration of a man telling the truth. She believed him. Not because she trusted everything people said. She didn't. She'd learned better. But because he had been demonstrating it for 6 months already, argument by argument, fence post by fence post, 11 unnecessary visits to a water situation that didn't require 11 visits. The evidence was already in. Ruth Coleman, informed by Anna, who had been watching the whole arc of this from the beginning, said when the courtship became official, "I called it in October." This was not entirely accurate. She had called it in November, but nobody corrected her because the important thing was that she'd been right. He asked her in the summer. Not with a ring produced from a pocket at a scenic overlook, though the overlook was there and was scenic enough. He asked her on a Saturday evening on her own porch after supper, because that was where they had taken to ending their evenings when the weather permitted, on the 2 chairs that faced the mountains and had accumulated, over 7 months of Sundays and most Saturdays, the comfortable authority of chairs that have been used by the same people long enough to become specifically theirs. "Clara," he said. "Harlan," she said, without looking up from whatever she was looking at, which was the way she said his name when she was at ease. "I need to ask you something." She looked up then. He was watching her with the steady, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered, and something in his expression was very direct, more direct than usual, and she understood immediately that the thing he was about to ask was the thing she had been thinking about, in the private, unannounced way that she thought about most things, since January. "Ask," she said. He turned toward her. "I'm going to be honest about what I'm asking," he said, "because I don't know another way. I want to marry you. I want to merge these properties and argue about the planting calendar and fix your fence posts and lose about 40% of our disagreements." She looked at him. 40%, she said. "That's my honest estimate." "I would put it higher," she said. "We can negotiate the percentage," he said. "What I'm asking is not negotiable." She was quiet for a moment. The mountains were doing what they always did, enormous and indifferent and faithful, and the light was going the way light goes in Wyoming in summer, slowly, as though it isn't entirely willing to leave. "You know what changed?" she said. "Between October and January?" When you were still being indirect? What? I started to think you didn't see it, she said. What was already there? I thought maybe I had read it wrong that evening at the social. I decided that if I was wrong, I needed to know, and if I was right, you needed a direction.
You gave me one, he said. You needed it, she said. You were going to think it through for another 6 months. Possibly, he said. Almost certainly, she said. And then, looking at him with everything she had been carrying since October, the full, clear weight of it, nothing held back. Yes, Harlan. Obviously, yes. You took long enough. I was being thorough, he said. You're always being thorough, she said. That's why I said yes.
They were married in September, when the valley was still warm and the aspens were just beginning to think about turning. The ceremony was at the community church, and the community came because this was the kind of town that understood when something worth attending was occurring. Ruth Coleman cried, which she denied later. Old Martin Webb, who had been the notary for the property resurvey, said that he had seen it coming since the moment Clara unrolled that surveyor's map. Danny, Eli's hired hand, showed up in a clean shirt that he had apparently pressed himself, which Clara later said was among the most touching things about the whole day. Clara wore her mother's dress, ivory cotton with small embroidered details at the collar that her mother had done herself years ago, kept in a cedar chest with the specific faith of a woman who expected her daughter would eventually have occasion for it. Eli stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him and thought, with the clarity that certain moments produce, that he had been arguing with this woman since October, and that every single argument had been, in its own way, a conversation he hadn't wanted to end, and had therefore kept going. He intended to have a great many more. They combined the properties that winter. This required several conversations about land management and cattle rotation and water allocation that occasionally became arguments and were always resolved, because that was the established method. Clara took over the accounts for the combined operation because her accounts were better, which Eli acknowledged without significant resistance because the numbers were simply correct, and Eli's relationship with the truth was too durable to survive a denial of something this obvious. The ranch grew. Clara's fields expanded. Their combined operation became, over the following decade, the kind of spread that other ranchers looked at with the respectful attention of people studying something that has been built correctly. Their first child arrived in the second year of marriage, a boy they named George, after Clara's father, which made Clara cry in the way that specific kindnesses produce tears in people who have learned to expect practical decisions more than sentimental ones. George had his father's patience and his mother's talent for finding the exact sentence that ended an argument, a combination that made his childhood interesting and his adulthood formidable. A daughter came 2 years after. They named her Ruth, because Ruth Coleman had been right in October, more or less, and because that seemed like a kind of justice. Ruth Harlan grew up to be deliberate and funny in the dry, precise way of her mother, with her father's habit of sitting with a problem until she was certain before she said anything. She became in time a very good lawyer, which surprised no one who had watched her grow up. The years accumulated the way years do when you're building something together that you intend to last. The ranch changed and grew and had its difficult seasons the way all things do and navigated them. The house had additions. The barn was rebuilt once. The mountains stayed the same, which Eli appreciated as a fixed point against which everything else changed. They still argued. This was not a failure. This was by design. Clara argued about whether the north pasture was being rested often enough. Eli argued about whether the winter hay stores were being replenished at the right rate. They had a disagreement about a new piece of equipment in their 14th year that lasted 2 weeks and was resolved, as their disagreements generally were, by one of them eventually producing evidence that the other respected enough to shift their position on. There was never any pretending, never any performance of harmony they didn't feel, never any false agreement in the interest of keeping the peace. What there was, instead, was the peace that doesn't require pretending, the peace of two people who know each other well enough to disagree honestly and care about each other enough to keep listening. On an evening 30 years into their marriage, they sat on the porch that had been rebuilt twice and was on its third set of boards, but was still somehow entirely itself. The mountains were catching the last of the light. Clara had tea. Eli had coffee. This had been a mild, ongoing disagreement since approximately their second week of marriage, conducted with the comfortable persistence of something that neither party actually wanted resolved. You know, Eli said, watching the mountains, coffee is the objectively correct evening choice. You've been saying that for 30 years, Clara said. It's been true for 30 years. It hasn't been any more true than it was to begin with, she said. 30 years of consistency should count for something, he said. Stubbornness and consistency are different words for the same behavior, Harlan. One just sounds more dignified. He looked at her. She was watching the mountains with the expression she wore when she was content, which was different from the expression she wore when she was simply comfortable, and he had learned to tell them apart a long time ago. She was 60 years old. Her hair had threads of gray in it now. Her hands were a rancher's hands, capable and marked by work. She was exactly who she had been on the morning. She walked up to his fence line with a surveyor's map and a measuring rope and the unbothered confidence of someone who already knew what the measurements would show. Clara, he said. Harlan, she said. I've been thinking, that's generally either excellent or alarming, she said, not looking away from the mountains. I've been thinking, he said, that I was technically right at the Founders' Night Social in 1879. She turned her head slowly to look at him. That, you said, at the rate you were going, you'd be a spinster by 30. He held her gaze with the composure of a man who has thought this through carefully and knows exactly where he wants to land. Because, he said, you subsequently confirmed that you would not have married anyone who hadn't specifically asked, which means my assessment of your trajectory, absent intervention, was accurate. A pause. Eli Harlan, she said. Are you claiming vindication for a joke you made 30 years ago on a technicality? I'm establishing an accurate historical record, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. The same laugh that had ambushed him at the fence line the first time. All those years ago, the laugh that escaped before she could architect it, that had nothing careful about it, that was entirely, uncontrollably real. The laugh that had made him smile without meaning to when he was only mildly annoyed, and started the whole long chain of events that had produced this porch, and this evening, and 30 years of arguments that neither of them had ever actually wanted to end. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had on 1,000 evenings, and they sat together in the last of the light and watched the sun go down over everything they had built, and the mountains held still, and the valley held them, and neither of them said anything more for a while because nothing more needed saying. Eli and Clara Harlan never had a grand moment. No rescue from peril, no moonlit declaration that anyone could point to and say that was the beginning. The beginning was a surveyor's map and a fence in the wrong place and a woman with the patience to hold her position until the man on the other side of the argument finally had the honesty to meet her there. The love that grew out of that was built from the same materials. Honesty, persistence, the willingness to argue about what actually mattered and then actually listen to the answer. The refusal to perform a version of a relationship that was more comfortable to look at than it was accurate to live. Here's the thing about two people who argue well together. The argument is not the obstacle. The argument is the evidence. The evidence that both people are taking the other seriously enough to push back, that neither person is quietly editing themselves into something more convenient, that the relationship is made of real material rather than the careful, fragile stuff that shatters the first-time reality, disagrees with the presentation. Clara knew Eli because he argued with her. Not around her, not in spite of her. Directly into her thinking, taking it seriously enough to contest it, which is its own form of devotion. Eli knew Clara because she did the same, and because she had the specific patience of a woman who was willing to wait for honesty without engineering it, to make her meaning plain without making it into a demand. Not unless you ask me. 5 words, said quietly, said once, said with a smile that was absolutely clear about what it was saying. Said by a woman who had decided that the moment had come and that this particular man, for all his thoroughness and his fence-line visiting and his unnecessary attention to watershed drainage, was not going to find his way there without a direction. She was right. He took the direction, he thought it through, which was how he did everything, and he arrived by January in the cold blue starlight of a Wyoming road at the answer that had been available for months, waiting for him to finish the approach. And then he walked across 3.5 feet of corrected boundary line with a post-hole digger and no ceremony and said the least romantic true thing she had ever heard in her life, and it was exactly right. They sat on that porch for decades after, watching the same mountains in the same light, holding the same hands, arguing about coffee and tea, winter wheat and planting calendars, the best way to store oats, the proper rotation of the north pasture. None of it resolved. All of it, in its way, the ongoing conversation of two people who were still paying attention to each other, still engaged, still interested, still unwilling to settle for the comfortable quiet of two people who have stopped listening and called it peace. That's what real partnership looks like from the inside. Not the absence of friction, the presence of two people who trust each other enough to produce it, who love each other enough to keep going, who know each other well enough to know the difference between an argument that matters and one that's just the shape that caring takes when it doesn't have anywhere else to go. I don't have a simpler definition than that, and I've spent a long time looking for one. Before we wrap today, I want to pause and ask you something directly. Where in the world are you hearing this story right now? Drop your country or your city in the comments below. I put a real effort into crafting every one of these, and knowing that it's reaching people in different corners of the world, that it's finding you wherever you are, matters to me more than I can easily say. So tell me. I want to know. And if this story found something in you today, if it stirred a memory or gave you a word for something you'd been feeling without language for, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the best thing we can do for the people we love is hand them a story that says the thing we didn't know how to say ourselves. Thank you for riding with me today. Until next time, keep riding.